Those darn Samaritans, they just refuse to understand the fact that they aren't as good as they think they are. I mean, they claim to be Jewish, but that's laughable. They have been intermarrying with those Goyim that the Assyrians moved into their land 700 years ago. 700 years of intermarrying with heathen Gentiles. None of the Samaritans can identify what tribe they're from. Where do you think the name the 10 lost tribes of Israel came from? Those records have been lost for centuries. And now there isn't a one of them that can prove for sure that they even have any Jewish blood. And what's more, they claim to worship God, but they accept only the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, as authoritative. They don't accept the Nevi'im, the writings of the prophets, or the Ketuvim, the Psalms and the wisdom literature, at all. They don't accept the mitzvot, the body of oral law, and so, of course, they don't follow the oral law, which means that they are unclean. For a Jew to associate with them in any way, to eat from one of their plates or drink from one of their cups, would render that Jew unclean. And the Samaritans, well, they even built their own temple. Can you believe it? God commanded that we worship him on Mount Zion, but they went and built a temple on Mount Gerizim to worship there. Their worship isn't even recognizable as worship of the one true God. It's idolatry, I tell you. It's no wonder that our rabbis speak out against those Samaritans. Did you know that there's a rabbinic saying that says, a piece of bread given by a Samaritan is more unclean than swine's flesh? In fact, there's a whole section of the Talmud called the Tractate Kutim that lists all of the restrictions in our dealings with those people. Unfortunately, racial prejudice is nothing new. These 2,000-year-old attitudes sound eerily familiar to the kind of things that we might have heard during the Civil Rights era, or even today among those in the world who reject the idea of welcoming the refugee or the sojourner. In Jesus' day, the Samaritans and the Jews despised each other. We need no more proof of that than the fact that the standard route a Jew would take while traveling from Galilee to Jerusalem would bypass Samaria entirely, traveling through Perea and crossing the Jordan River near Jericho. It was a 5 to 7 day journey. A direct route through Samaria would only have taken 3 days. But those extra few days traveling were well worth it because the Samaritans were well known for mistreating traveling Jews and sometimes even killing them. But in today's story, Jesus and his disciples are traveling from Galilee to Jerusalem, and Jesus has chosen to take them all straight through Samaria. It's just about noon, and Jesus sends the disciples into a nearby town to buy something for them all to eat. But Jesus continues on a short way until he gets to a well where he sits down to rest. Shortly thereafter, a Samaritan woman comes to the well to draw some water, and Jesus asks her for a drink. Now, we've already talked about the animosity that existed between the Jews and the Samaritans, and so the woman is taken aback. Not only that a Jew would be asking a Samaritan for a drink, remember, for a Jew to drink from a Samaritan's cup would render them unclean, but also because it was a giant breach of protocol for a man to speak to a woman, any woman, in public. Believe it or not, a Jewish man was not even permitted to speak to his own wife in public. And so here, in what seems to us to be a pretty innocuous request, Jesus has crossed 2 pretty significant boundaries. And so the Samaritan woman called him on it. "You're a Jew and I am a Samaritan woman," she said. "How can you ask me for a drink?" But just like Jesus did with Nicodemus last week, he skips by her question and gets straight to the point. If you knew the gift of God and who it is that asks you for a drink, you would have asked him and he would have given you living water, Jesus said. And like Nicodemus, the Samaritan woman takes Jesus literally. "You have nothing to draw with and the well is deep," she said. "Where can you get this living water?" And Jesus, still speaking allegorically, replies, "Everyone who drinks this water will be thirsty again, But whoever drinks the water I give them will never thirst. Indeed, the water I give them will become in them a spring of water welling up to eternal life." Our Samaritan friend apparently likes the idea of not having to trudge back and forth to the well every day, and so she asks Jesus if he can give her some of this living water. Jesus then suggested that she go back to the town and get her husband. This is not as strange a request as it may seem. Jesus has already breached protocol by talking to this woman in public, and asking her to bring her husband before continuing their discussion would render this whole discussion a bit more appropriate. But we soon find out this isn't why Jesus was asking this, because as the woman replies that she has no husband, Jesus takes advantage of this opportunity to reveal the fact that he knows her, that he knows that she has been married 5 times and that she is not now married to the man that she is with. And now I need to interrupt the story for a minute because there is a lot happening here that we need to talk about. I have a card that I've been carrying around in my wallet since about 1981. Some of you have seen it. The card gives a dictionary definition of the word coincidence. And the definition that it gives for that word is when God works a miracle and remains anonymous. That's what a coincidence is. And so, first of all, yes, it was the women who came to the well every day to fill their jars and to carry those heavy jars of water back to their homes. And women would do this early in the morning or early in the evening in order to avoid the noonday heat. And yet here our Samaritan friend is coming to the well at noon in the heat of the day. And before we judge this woman too harshly, let's remember that women did not have the privilege of initiating a divorce. That was exclusively a husband's prerogative. But still, the fact that she was coming here in the heat of the afternoon is a pretty clear indication that she was avoiding the other women from the town. She was avoiding the hurtful comments, the judgmental glances, the disdain with which the others treated her. It was just easier for her to come here when no one else was here. And so the first question I have to ask is, does anyone think that it is a random coincidence that Jesus met this particular woman at this particular time in this particular place? Or do we think it's more likely that Jesus planned to meet her? Possibly that the entire reason that Jesus chose the perilous route through Samaria was so that he could be at that well at that time, specifically to meet her. Second, what do we think that Jesus approaching the Samaritan woman and speaking with her teaches us about what Jesus believed about racial equality? Jesus didn't care that she was a despised Samaritan. She certainly wasn't despised by Jesus, and Jesus would not have hesitated to drink from one of her cups. And what do we think that Jesus' actions teach us about what Jesus believed about gender equality? Jesus did not hesitate to speak to this woman. In spite of the misogynistic rules of his time and place, Jesus spoke to her directly and lovingly. In short, there were no boundaries that were going to keep Jesus from touching the life of this Samaritan woman and bringing her to a saving faith in him. James Lawrence says if there is one thing we know about Jesus, it is that he reaches out to people just like this woman. When God knows our hearts, and when he knows that we are open to his calling, there is nothing that will keep him from adopting us as his own. Nothing. And so our story continues. We don't know if our Samaritan friend was trying to change the subject because she was uncomfortable with the way that Jesus revealed the depths of her personal life, or if perhaps she recognized that the only way that Jesus could have known these things about her was through divine intervention of some sort. And so she said, "I can see that you are a prophet." Then she launched into a discussion basically complaining about the way that the Jews discredit the worship of the Samaritans, which truthfully they did. The Jews claimed that Mount Gerizim was not an appropriate site for worship, and so essentially that the Samaritans' prayers were not heard by God. Jesus begins his response in a way that may at first have sounded like he was agreeing that the Samaritans were worshiping in the wrong place, but it quickly becomes apparent that Jesus was actually talking about something completely different. You Samaritans worship what you do not know. We worship what we do know, for salvation is from the Jews, Jesus said. But this statement was not about invalidating Samaritan worship. This statement was about leading the Samaritans to understand the fact that the God of Israel can only be understood in the light of the way that God has chosen to reveal himself through the nation of Israel. That if we want to know God, we discover him through the Hebrew Scriptures and through the witness of his Son, Jesus, to whom the entire Bible points. Jesus then tells her that a time is coming and has now come when the true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and in truth, for they are the kind of worshipers the Father seeks. It's no longer about where you worship. It's about worship pouring out from the heart that has been touched by God's Spirit, a heart from which springs forth the living water about which Jesus had just spoken. Our Samaritan friend, very possibly led by the Spirit at this point, states that she knows that when the Jewish Messiah comes, he will explain everything. And for the first time in his ministry, Jesus says plainly, I am he. But when Jesus says this, he uses the Greek phrase, ego eimi, which is the exact I am that was spoken by God when he identified himself to Moses. Jesus leaves no room for doubt in his statement about the fact that he is indeed the Messiah. As the disciples finally arrive with the food, and that is a story for another day, our Samaritan friend who came to the well to draw water to bring home leaves without her water because something else has become the matter of primary importance. And as this living water with which Jesus has gifted her wells up from her heart, she runs back to the town. Come see a man who told me everything I ever did, the woman told the townspeople. Could this be the Messiah? And the people in her town, those whom she had sought to avoid by coming to the well in the heat of the day, now heard her knocking on their doors, bringing the good news of the gospel and bringing it with joy. Now let me briefly step away from our story one more time so we can notice something important. Jesus never said one word about this woman's sin. He didn't condemn her. He didn't reprimand her. He simply, lovingly guided her to an understanding of who he is. Jesus' goal wasn't retribution. His goal was reconciliation. This is why John tells us that he came into the world not to condemn the world, but that the world might be saved through him. If a woman, 5 times married and now living unmarried with a partner, if a woman ostracized by her community, if a woman with no training in the law or the prophets, if a woman of possibly dubious moral character can boldly and joyfully carry the good news of the gospel to the very town of people who had shunned her, what excuse do we have not to be joyful bearers of the good news of the gospel also? Because of our Samaritan friend's witness, Jesus was invited to stay in that town for a few days and to teach the townspeople of God's love and acceptance, even acceptance of those darn Samaritans. Our text tells us that because of Jesus' teaching over those few days, many of the Samaritans became believers. So no, I don't believe in coincidences, at least not random ones. Before he even met our Samaritan friend, Jesus knew her heart, and he knew that touching her life with the power of God's love was going to make a difference not only in her life, but in the lives of the many townsfolk among whom she lived, who would hear her and believe the gospel also. My dear friends, we do not serve a God of retribution. We serve a God of reconciliation, a God who lovingly and graciously forgives our imperfections and calls us to his side that we may become members of his family redeemed, forgiven, and loved. Amen.